In the UK market and the European market as a whole, the system-dedicated magazines and all of the personalities that they brought up with them would not only become signs of their time, but also spawn many of the creatives and business people who would then go on to shape the video game industry for decades to come. We're joined today by one such gent who started off with, well, less than humble beginnings. I mean, he's a champion right off the bat, and goes on to have a very, very interesting career. And I'm very much looking forward to this conversation today. Jaz Rignall, welcome to the show.
Pleased to meet you. Nice to be here.
So I always start this off. I ask people, what is your educational background?
Well, to be honest, my education was pretty bad. Well, actually, no, it wasn't bad. I was bad. I was a smart kid. In high school, I did very, very well. But unfortunately, in between sort of high school and the secondary level, where you study for college, I discovered video games, realized I was good at them, won a national competition. And just began thinking, I really want to write for magazines. I was originally going to be a designer. I was a good artist and thought, I could design magazines. That would be fun. But actually, sort of once I started playing video games and I was, reading magazines, I had a basic, decent writing talent. I got good marks in English, and I just thought, that's what I want to do. I want to write and review games, especially as, at the time I'd bought a couple of games whose reviews I'd read that were very good. And I, destroyed them in a night. And it was just like, I'm so fed up. I didn't have much money as a kid. And so, you'd buy a game and that would be the game that you'd have to play for 2 or 3 months, and I'd complete it in a night and then just be like, I've just spent all my money on this thing, and now I've got this game which is I've completely smashed to pieces, and I don't want to play anymore because I've finished it. And so I had this very strong feeling of like, I think I can review games better than other people. So basically, I kind of started submitting kind of hints and tips, and then and that got me kind of noticed. And eventually got a full-time job at ZZAP 64 magazine, which was a magazine dedicated to the Commodore 64. And I really went in. It was almost like an apprenticeship in a way, because back then there was nothing about video game journalism or anything like that. You did a traditional journalist course at university, and then would sort of adapt that for video games. So in a way, kind of going in with no real formal journalistic training, but just a very, very strong opinion on how I wanted to write about games. It was kind of interesting, because what it allowed us to do was really approach making magazines with a very, very fresh perspective. We weren't bound by, sort of journalistic traditions. Of course, we felt, accuracy was very important, being exciting, and all these kinds of things. The stuff that, being very informative and sort of on the money. That was very important to us, of course. Sort of maintaining the journalistic standard. But also, we were sort of, we felt we should be able to sort of talk using gamers' terms and slang, and sort of speak the language of the gamer, which a lot of the other video game magazines at the time, because they were staffed by traditional journalists, they had this kind of slightly stiff feel to them. Some of the staff members, I mean, they were good journalists, but they didn't necessarily kind of get games in the same way that young gamers were getting them. They didn't quite understand them in the same way, because these guys were a little bit older, and they just had a sort of a different opinion. So sometimes when they reviewed games, it would be like, what are you talking about? You're focusing on some weird thing like the cover of the game, and not actually talking about the gameplay or the graphics or the stuff that we really care about. So I mean, basically what that allowed us to do was sort of create a magazine that was unlike almost all the other magazines that were out there at the time, that really kind of felt like, wow, this magazine's got people in it that they're gamers like me, and they're young, and they talk the same language. So that had a very, very strong appeal for the readers. And very quickly we learned, you know, it's like, way to be successful, particularly early on, is almost like being a friend of the gamer. You know, you sort of like a slightly older person that they might know, who can sort of offer them advice about games, but nevertheless understands them and speaks their language. So that was that was my sort of journey into the games industry, was essentially sort of joining a magazine and being able to build something that was very different and unique, and to, you know, blow my own trumpet a bit, or our own trumpet, because we were a team, but something that I feel really helped steer games journalism in a different way than sort of the way it had done in the sort of the prior 4 or so years that you know, magazines had existed.
Well, and I think that is definitely an interesting counterpoint to a lot of the magazines, especially if you contrast it with American magazines at the same time, a very, very different world. So you win the championship. Now, before winning the championship, are you engaged in this sending in tips or anything, or is it purely just you're playing arcade games?
That happened after. Basically, you know, I was a hardcore gamer, arcade gamer, because I didn't have enough money to buy a computer or a console, but, you know, video games, the arcade machines, that is, you know, I could afford 10p a go in those, no problem at all. You know, I found that I was very good at them, and basically I sort of started to read magazines, and just at the sort of the point when I sort of began to seriously read magazines, I saw their announcement for the championship, so I entered it. And once I sort of entered the championship, at that point, people weren't really doing hints and tips on games, but I remember reading one, and I can't remember. It was a book. Can't remember the author, but it was like a hints and tips book. Well, I think the very first one that was made. It was called something like How to Master the Arcade Games, and it was an American book, and it covered the sort of the 30 most popular arcade games.
Was it How to Win at Video Games?
Let me see.
That was one of the very early ones, but yeah, there was a flurry of them all within about a 6-month period. The market was just flooded with them. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, by Tom Hirschfield, How to Master the Video Games, and so
gotcha.
I think it was on Bantam, and I don't even remember where I got it from, because I had an American copy of the book, but somehow I got hold of it, read it, and just went, holy moly! People are writing tips for games. That's such a good thing. And once I'd won the championship, I was like, I can play games. I can do this. So that's when I started sending tips in. And because nobody else was really doing it at the time, of course, people noticed me, you know, my name coming up sort of every so often. Oh, look, this guy again, he's telling us how to play pole position, and now he's talking about how to play Gallagher and stuff. And so I began to get known, and that's how my name began to sort of circulate in the, you know, in the sort of the circles that eventually, of the people that eventually employed me.
Gotcha. Now, when do you see an ad that they're hiring people for this new magazine? Have you read or I should say, just to get the timeline right, are you coming into ZZAP as one of the original editors or one of the original journalists? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, but basically, I mean, it wasn't even an ad. What had happened was that I'd sort of contributed a bunch of hints and tips to Computer and Video Games magazine, and I'd started reading this other magazine called Personal Computer Games, PCG, that was run by Chris Anderson, who eventually went on to launch Future, and it now owns all the TED Talks properties and has more money than God. But back then, he was just an ordinary editor living in the southwest of England, and he'd been running this PCG magazine for a company called V&U, and I don't really know the sort of the ins and outs of it. But the magazine got closed down very unexpectedly, and which was a shame, actually, because it was a very, very good magazine. However, Chris had been sort of noticed by Newsfield, who published a magazine called Crash, which is all about the ZX Spectrum, and that was another very revolutionary, very different kind of a magazine that the reviews were all written by local kids who would come into the office. They would write these reviews, and then Roger Keane, who ran the magazine, would edit them. So you had these reviews that weren't written by professional reviewers or written by kids, but sort of edited so that they made sense. And so that was really one of the first times where you had sort of real gamers, kids, writing reviews. And so having had this Spectrum magazine, which was very, very popular, revolutionary in a way, the Newsfield guys said, we should do this for Commodore 64, and we know the person to hire, and that's Chris. And so they approached Chris, brought him on board, and because I'd been writing hints and tips for PCG, Chris's magazine, he kind of sat down and sort of said, I don't really want to do the same thing that Crash did with kids, but what I want to do is bring in some very young gamers who are gamers first and foremost and train them how to write so they can become full-time journalists. And so what I'll do is I'll hire Gary Penn, who was another guy that was writing hints and tips for PCG. So it was like, we knew how to play games. The both of us had actually been to another little gaming contest at the magazine a few months beforehand. So he had met us, and at that little sort of competition, he'd chatted to us and sort of, I think inadvertently, I'd sort of, I said the right things to him because I was talking to him about, the fact that I just bought Bruce Lee, which is a great game, very, very loved game on the Commodore 64. But me being me and sort of good, I got it that afternoon, played it, and by the end of the evening, finished it and was like, what the fuck? I just spent all this money on this game, and after what he finished it, it's not hard enough. So I was moaning to him about that, saying, I'd read these reviews, and some of these reviewers can't play games, and they should have people like us. So anyway, a few months later, it was January. I'd actually finished school the previous summer, and basically because I lived in the middle of nowhere in Wales, which is sort of the west part of the United Kingdom, where there's just nothing except sheep and fields and mountains. I had no job opportunities. I didn't know really what to do, but I got this call from Chris out of the blue one night, who said, I'm setting up a new magazine, and I think you might be the right kind of a person to become a reviewer. Come down for an interview in London on next week, and we can talk. So I was just like, oh my God, I can't believe it. So and I told my parents, of course, and they were thrilled because they were just sitting around going like, is this kid going to be sitting around the house for the rest of eternity, not being able to get a job? Went down, had a great interview, got on very well, and he hired me. So completely unexpected, out of the blue. In some sense, it feels like luck, but in another sense, I kind of helped make that luck. So it was one of those things where it's like a lot of things coming together to give me my big break, and it was about as big of a break as I could possibly hope for.
Now, obviously, you're coming from the arcade games, moving on to computer games. And you said already, you'd bought things like Bruce Lee. So at this point, I'm guessing you've already got a Commodore 64, or did you really play one of the UK ports?
Actually, I had an Atari, and that was one of the sort of, that was the sort of a tricky interview point was, I didn't want to tell Chris that I didn't have a Commodore 64, but fortunately, because I had the Atari computer that had a lot of games that were also Commodore games, I was able to talk a lot about the games that I'd played that were Commodore games, and sort of bullshit and fudge the stuff that I didn't really know about. And it was fine because ultimately, when I got to ZZAP, then I played. It was actually fun, playing catch up, sort of playing all of the older Commodore 64 games that I'd missed, which I did that over probably about a month or 2 months. And that was sort of, I'd work and review during the day, and then I'd spend 5 or 6 hours at night playing through game after game. So I had a complete and full understanding of sort of the Commodore 64 gaming universe that then allowed me to really judge, what's good, what's bad, is this an original game or is there another one like it? And so yeah, it was really fun, a lot of hard work, but great fun because it was like being kid in a candy store. I was drawing a video game magazine who's suddenly got these shelves and shelves full of games that I've never played. I was just like, oh my god, I can't believe it. So
well, and I gotta ask because this is a brand new magazine, you obviously coming into it, and some work had already been done to set the thing up ahead of time. How does this even work? Where did somebody go down to the shops and pick up as many games as they could to build up a library? Is there a relationship with the publishers to get the games? In the first phase of the magazine, how does that work?
Yeah, that was interesting actually, because when I walked into the ZZAP offices in February 1985, and basically Chris had, because he'd worked at Personal Computer Games, and they obviously had a massive library of games and a reasonable relationship with all the publishers. He basically stole all the Commodore 64 games and bought them with him. So it was, the magazine immediately had that instant library of all the games because he stole them all from Personal Computer Games, because they didn't want them anymore anyway. It's they got rid of the magazine. They weren't producing any computer magazine, so he was just like, yeah, I'll take these. So and Chris had a lot of contacts because he'd been working at PCG probably for about a year maybe at that point. So he'd established some pretty good relationships running that magazine, and so he would call people up, but he'd also tell us, go and call so and so and ask them about this, and we'd do it, and sort of in a way. It used to. I'm a big introvert, and so even though I'm quite personal stuff, actually things like cold calling people I don't know, oh my god, I get anxious, I hate it. I don't know this person, what am I going to say? And so I had to sort of battle that horrible anxiety of sort of cold calling someone saying, I've heard that you're making a game, can you send it to us? But eventually I kind of got over it. I still don't like it, but you just get used to it. And slowly we all began to build these relationships. And I remember having kind of funny conversations with like Rare back in the day, because we'd call them up and say, you've made these Commodore 64 games, what are you making next? Are you doing something that'd be all secretive? And we'd talk to the stampers and stuff, because there were only a few of them there, and then so you begin to sort of get to know people and sort of build those relationships. It was fun. It was we came into the industry as nobodies, but eventually and actually quite quickly, because the thing is, no other magazine had like little pictures, and there were the pictures of the reviewers in the magazine, which we thought was a good idea, and it was actually, because depending on how you were feeling about the game, there'd be like a thumbs up picture, or us being sick, or sort of turning our nose up at how horrible the game was. So when you looked at the page, not only could you immediately recognize who had written what because there were their picture there, but you knew what they thought because they were either smiling or making some horrible face. And so because of that, at a time when the industry was quite faceless in a way, that there were a few well-known programmers, the Jeff Minters and the Andrew Brayrooks and Archer McLean, and these sort of high-level, sort of top-level programmers. But other than that, it was just about the companies, and so us sort of putting this sort of friendly face on gaming and being being seen, we've kind of put a face on the industry. So when we would call people up, they would know who we were because they'd seen us. And which one are you? You the one with the spiky hair, or the other one with spiky hair? And so they would they would see us, and when they came to the magazine, they would recognize us because they'd seen our pictures and our photos all over the magazine. It was very personality driven stuff at a time when video gaming was quite faceless and anonymous in a way.
Well, definitely. Now, so you're working there. Obviously, the number of games appearing every month, especially 85, 86, is a tremendous number. Uh, how is that schedule internally working? I mean, how much time are the individual reviewers actually spending on an individual title? Because especially in ZZAP, I mean, you'd have quite a few games that would be reviewed by multiple people. So was there an editorial decision made about it? Was it one guy is reviewing it going, this thing is great, and so more people jump on board so there's more opinions to have? What does the month-to-month planning look like in ZZAP in the mid-'80s?
Yeah, it was a challenge, and and this is sort of the, on the one hand, being a games reviewer was the most fun job in the world, and on the other hand, it also really, really sucked because you did very, very long hours. So the way it would work out was basically, as games came in, oftentimes we would pick the games that we felt we were sort of best suited to review. So, I usually go for the shooters because I'm good at shooters. Gary would pick the more thoughtful, more detailed games, the more original, interesting ones. I was very much an arcade player. He was an arcade. We were both all rounders. In fact, all the reviewers, could play any kind of game. But we obviously had preferences. So that would make it easy. Sometimes some really high level, high profile game would come in, and we'd literally be rolling dice to review it because everybody would want to do it. But you had the lead reviewer, and they would write the description of the game that kind of, back then it was important because there were so many new concepts and game mechanics and new game ideas and all that kind of thing. The review, it was important for us to explain what the game was and how it worked. We don't have to do that these days because everybody knows what a match 3 game is or what an arcade adventure is. But back then we were literally saying, you fly through a stage and then then a boss comes along and you beat him up. You'd have to explain all that. So they would write the basic review, which explained what the game was. And then, the lead comment, which would reveal their opinion of it. And then at some point over the next few days, the other two reviewers, because we always had 3 opinions per review, which was too much, but was great. They would also play it and write their review. And in terms of time spent, I mean, that varied a lot. But here's the thing to remember, which is kind of funny in a way. Firstly, both Gary and I, in particular, were very, very good at games. I was a national champion. He knew games inside out. Was really talented too. So actually, a game would come in, and back then, you're talking about little, tiny, simple games, all to fit within the Commodore 64. So it's not like we had giant, sprawling MMOs that took 30 hours to get through. I mean, a lot of these games, they were very, very difficult. And the reason why they were difficult is because they only had 5 levels, and if you got through them, it wouldn't take very long at all. But even though they were very difficult, and we liked that, we could get through these games very, very, very quickly. I mean, sometimes I've written reviews where it's like, I finished this game on my first sitting and it sucks, and it's and that was 10 minutes play. So like literally about 10 minutes play, finish the game, and now I can write the review. Sure, there were definitely some games that would take you a lot longer, particularly some of the ultimate arcade adventures that were complicated or games that had many screens to get through. And oftentimes we would sort of tag team that. So I'd play for a bit, save it or leave it, and Gary would come in and play it, and we'd sort of work our way through the game together. And sometimes, we would just be like, fuck it. We played this game for 20 minutes. We know it's crap. We don't need to play the rest of the game because it ain't getting any better, and we know it. And we would write the review. So yeah, it varied. Ideally, we would like to finish the game, and that way we felt that it was a proper full review. But some games you just knew what they were going to be, and how many times you have to play the same level to kind of form an opinion. It's like a lot of the times you just see it and know immediately, yeah, this is a mediocre platform game. It's 70% ish. It's like many others, and why spend that extra time? It's not really going to change your review, and the chances of the final level being some kind of miracle thing that changes your rating from a 70 to a 90. That ain't ever going to happen. So that was our basic philosophy there.
Gotcha. Now, obviously magazines live off of advertising, especially back in the day. So, and I'm guessing a lot of that happened at the editorial level, not at the journalist level. But what was, from your point of view, what was your experience of the relationship with publishers, both as suppliers of the product you were reviewing and as advertisers?
It was quite a merry dance in a way, and we can talk about the difference between America and the UK a little bit later, because actually they are very big differences and very, very important differences. But the thing with the UK was interesting was that because in the UK distribution is very, very efficient for magazines, and so if you're smart, you can. As just a typical example, if you print 100,000 magazines, you're hoping to sell between 90 to 95,000 of them, and you'll get the 5,000 will get sent back. Only their covers will be sent back as proof that they didn't get sold, and obviously that would be deducted from your circulation, and also that's revenue that you didn't earn. So. And this is because the UK and parts of Europe are very efficient. We know roughly how many magazines are being sold in specific news agents. There was the publisher the publishers that we all worked with were had people that the distribution companies had people that would make sure that we weren't sending 100 magazines to a news agent that only sold 10 of them, and also not sending 10 that sold 100. So it was very, very efficient. So first of all, what that meant was when we printed magazines, we didn't have a lot of wastage. So that actually gave us a really decent amount of revenue, completely separate from the ads. That it's a circulation revenue, which is the money you just make physically selling a magazine. Actually can support you quite strongly. So what happens is the ads then become extra revenue. So America, unfortunately, being unbelievably inefficient, you are lucky if you sell 30% of the magazines that you print. So that means 70% of what you print is thrown in the bin and doesn't make you any money. So what that means is you are desperate for advertising. If your advertising goes away, you're screwed and out of business. So and advertisers know that. So what that means is advertisers in America know that if they lean on a magazine and kind of go, we didn't like that, we're thinking of pulling out our ads, you're screwed. And the ad managers and the business people are going to go absolutely crazy and pile the pressure on the editorial team to do whatever it is that they think they need to do to keep the business. And so, not ideal. In Europe, however, we had the same thing. US Gold is a perfect case in point. There was a guy there called Tim Cheney who was like their sort of marketing PR lead head, and he was always calling us up. We'd review some US Gold game or other and give it a terrible rating and say it's bad, and he'd be like, "I'm pulling all my advertising
for a US Gold game."
Yeah,
no,
what a shocker!
Say it's
right?
not so.
And he would yell at us, and why did he give this game a poor rating? It's great, and look, it's selling well. And I'd have to explain the concept to him that you can have a #1 record, but it might a lot of people won't like it. And it's the same with games. It's like it might be a #1 game, but it doesn't. It's not necessarily high quality. Anyway, the point being, he would threaten to pull ads, and it wouldn't. Obviously, it would upset the ad managers and the business people because it's money left on the table. But at the same time, it's not like they had a lot of leverage over us, because if we lost some ads, it didn't matter too much in the scheme of things. So we can afford to sort of say, all right, fuck off then, and take your ads to another magazine. And of course, the other thing is our magazines were the best selling, so we knew that actually they would always come back to us because we had the highest circulation and stuff, and so there was always nonsense and shenanigans going on with the people and sort of this threatening to pull ads. It probably happened sort of once every couple of months. There's something would go on, but ultimately it didn't really mess things up, and it certainly didn't change sort of the way that we approach things on an editorial front.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, yeah, because obviously, like you said, the U.S. side is extremely dependent, but you have experience with that as well. We'll get to that here in a little bit. So now, as the years go by at ZZAP, obviously technology is not standing still, and one of the issues of a single format magazine is, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that at some point that format's going to die.
Absolutely.
So how did that manifest itself for you guys? Because not only do you have the C64 market maturing at a certain point, you also have the follow-up machine, the Amiga, coming in. What were the decisions and what were the thought processes inside the magazine for dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean that was a very big thing. I mean, I'm always been about new technology, and probably in 1987, mid 1987, I think. We began to cover the 16-bit computers in ZZAP because I felt very strongly the Commodore 64 ain't going to last a lifetime. We can see that there's a new Amiga and this Atari ST 16-bit computers coming along, and at that point we just thought, they're going to supersede the old 8-bit machines, and the industry will just carry on being a computer-based industry. And so we started to cover the Amiga, and actually we got some letters from all the readers were kids basically, but the kids saying, we don't want to see Amiga coverage in ZZAP. It's not what we want. We're Commodore 64 owners. And that feedback came at a time when Newsfield they'd launched a magazine called LM, which was a sort of a lifestyle magazine. It was kind of like what in the 90s was called a lad mag, which was sort of a magazine aimed at young males, movies, video games, drinking, sex, the stuff that they think would appeal to young males. And while that magazine became huge in the 90s, and advertisers really latched onto that, in the 80s when Newsfield launched it, nobody was ready for it. Advertisers didn't like it. Readers weren't interested in reading it, and it cost them about £500,000, which for a small company was just an absolutely devastating hit. So basically, sort of Newsfield had kind of spent all its cash reserves and was very, very nervous about its cash cows at that point, which were basically Crash and ZZAP. So when owner Roger saw these letters from readers, there weren't that many. He just sort of saw them, and it was at sort of the wrong place at the wrong time. He just said, nope, you got to stop covering the Amiga in ZZAP and just make it a Commodore 64 magazine, which I was very, very, very much opposed to. And actually, what happened was, once I realized it's like, they're taking away the most exciting and interesting thing that I was looking forward to out of ZZAP. Maybe I need to go and work somewhere else. So that at that point I began looking for a new job and eventually and moved over to EMAP and Computer and Video Games magazine in particular within a few months. And basically that was coupled with the fact that actually I'd bought myself a new Nintendo console, which I thought was absolutely fantastic, which had just sort of come out, and a Master System console, which had also just come out. And I'd been looking at these things, and I've been like, these new consoles, they're pretty freaking cool. I'd played Super Mario, which was just so good, much better than almost all of the Commodore 64 games in terms of there wasn't another platform game like it on the Commodore 64. I was like, "Whoa, these are pretty good." And then I saw about this new thing called a PC Engine, which had just been launched in Japan, which was this tiny little, very, very cool console that had just these games that it was a tiny console, but it was like punching well above its weight. It's like, I can't believe that tiny little console can make a version of R-Type that looks almost indistinguishable from the arcade game. And I was very, very excited about that. And I was just like, you know what? I need to be at another magazine writing about this because this stuff is cool. I don't want to be stuck being a Commodore 64 reviewer for the rest of my life, because the rest of my life won't be very long if that's the case.
And this does bring up an interesting point. Obviously, again, huge distinctions with the U.S. market and the way that both markets evolved. And since you also did mention it with Crash, since both Crash and ZZAP were at Newsfield, what was the cross-pollination between the two magazines like early on, if any?
Yeah, it was funny in a way. I mean, we were all working out the same tiny office. I mean, Crash and ZZAP were basically sort of shared a room. But I mean, ultimately, we had so much work to do that, I'd keep an eye on what the Crash folks were doing, what they were playing. We'd see all the games. Everybody was aware of what everybody was doing because, we were all in the same room. But we were sort of, the magazine had a sort of a very different philosophy. You had Crash with the kids kind of constantly coming in and out. Eventually, they brought in full-time reviewers, and it became a bit more like ZZAP. But because we were most of the time, we've just had our heads down, just, banging out the magazines and reviewing games and stuff. So, we'd sometimes sort of go together to visit a developer, and the Crash people would talk to the Spectrum guys, and I'd talk to the Commodore guys, and that sort of thing. We'd go to arcade shows together and that sort of thing. But in terms of the actual editorial, there wasn't much crossover. They were sort of treated as very, as unique and different things.
Okay, and since we're now talking about all these different platforms that are hovering around at the same time, obviously you've got the classic schoolyard fights between which computer did your parents buy you, but the personality driven aspects of magazines like ZZAP lent themselves a little bit to that feeling of, okay, these are our guys who like our system, because you're not going to start promoting a different system in the magazine that you're writing. How did that manifest? I mean, for you guys, because like you said, you're big, you always want the new technology. Obviously, the kids also always want the new technology. That's why we went to the arcades every week. Just open source here. I was a Commodore 64 kid too. But I lived in the arcades on the weekends. So the question is, how did you guys walk that line to keep that image going, to appeal to the same kids who are writing you letters, no Amiga in our Commodore 64? How does that express itself then in the way that you guys are covering this stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it was, we were expected to be Commodore 64 advocates, both by our employees and our readers. Definitely, very much so by our readers. So even though I'd had a Spectrum during the early years, and we worked with the Crash people, and I saw the Spectrum games coming in and would play them if I saw a good one that I liked, just to see what it was like, because I'm a gamer and I don't give a crap what the platform is. Ultimately, it's like, I'm all about the games. Give me a game, I want to play it. And so even in the magazine, we'd make fun of the Spectrum and sort of advocate for the Commodore 64. And make sure that we were the cheerleaders that the readers wanted us to be. At the same time, I have my eye on everything, and so to me it was like, my job is to tell people where they can get the best gaming experiences, and that's partly why I made the move in to computer and video games in 1988, was because I was thinking, I think the best video game experiences right now are being delivered by consoles, and I want to go over to CMVG and write about this and tell people why, and that's what I did. I mean, I didn't take me long to take over the Mean Machines console column, and and I started reviewing the console games. I was also reviewing all the computer games too, but console games became a big passion of mine, and and I was like, I'm advocating for these things because I think they're the best, and that's what I did, and eventually we spun off console magazines and that kind of thing because the market grew and changed, and of course the big question is, did the market grow and change because of the journalism at the time? And I think there's definitely some truth in that, where you had people like me and Tony Takushi and others basically saying, look what's happening in Japan. Holy crap, this new Mega Drive's coming along and it's got these arcade conversions, and wow, they look at them, they're great. And so of course kids will read that and just go like, whoa, I want that too. And so not long after, importers began to spring up, bringing in Japanese consoles and games and stuff, and the market began to move and change. And this was off the back of people kind of getting a bit bored of their Commodore 64s, looking at the Amiga and kind of going, I don't know how I can afford £400, which in today's money is what, 1,200 quid or something crazy, really expensive stuff. I can't afford that. But you know what? I can spend $150 on a Nintendo or a Master System. Games might be more expensive, but I don't care. I'll deal with that. I'll swap them with my friends or whatever. What I want is a cheap, cool, fun thing to play games on, and the consoles were it.
Definitely understand that. Now, you were also, if I'm not mistaken, you were the editor of ZZAP for a brief while right before you left, right?
Yeah, I was probably about a year, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. How did that role differ from your role as a journalist, and what were there any surprises once you actually took that position?
I mean, by the time I took over the role, I'd sort of, I'd been at the magazine for almost 3 years at that point, and so I was very aware of all the procedures and the way that the magazine was planned and all that kind of stuff. So, to me, it was like pretty straightforward, stepping up, and I kind of knew how the magazine worked. Obviously, I had to then, spend a lot more time editing other people's work, but I still wrote reviews, and it was very important. And I wrote a comment for almost every game that we reviewed. So yeah, it was just like a lot more hard work, with a little bit less writing and a lot more organization and chasing people down and making sure freelance was being paid and all that kind of extra stuff that comes part and parcel of running a magazine. And even I think at that time I was 21 or 22, which feels very, very young to be running a magazine. But I mean, Newsfield trusted us, and obviously we did it because they were very successful and we didn't miss deadlines.
There you go. So you move on to multi-platform magazine, and obviously now I'm guessing there's got to be a certain amount of additional hierarchy and organization just to be able to deal with a much larger palette of games every month, and I'm guessing you weren't reviewing every single game that's coming out for every platform at that point. So how does that organizational side change when you move to a multi-platform publication?
Yeah, it was a lot more challenging because obviously we cover every single format. And and in the late 80s, it was beginning to get crazy because you had the old 8-bit computers, the new 16-bit computers, the relatively new 8-bit consoles, and the brand new 16-bit consoles, and other stuff beginning to pop up. So yeah, it was quite crazy. But the way we saw it was once I kind of got into a position where I could properly influence the magazine and the editorial, we just took the decision to, you know what, it doesn't matter what platform it's on, we're just going to talk about the very best games of the month. So what you're going to see in the magazine, you're going to pick up the magazine and you're just going to see the greatest games. And if they're all Amiga games that month, they're all Amiga games, and if they're all console games, they're all console games. At that point, we still separated consoles from computers. We had a console column, which was beginning to become sort of, a big part of the magazine. But most of the releases at that point were still computer releases. So those are all at the front of the magazine. And it's a little bit of organizational nightmare. Obviously, a lot of having a quick look at a game and kind of going, is it good or not? Yeah, maybe we should review it. No, clearly not. Throw it in the bin. Or yeah, this is great. That might even go on the cover. So we had that sort of thing going on at the start of the month. But ultimately the philosophy was, if it was really good, we need to review it.
Gotcha. Now, obviously, media costs more if you're moving on to cartridge than the old cassettes and so forth. So getting review copies, relationships with the console makers, because they obviously have a lot more writing on each release. Was there any kind of new pressure or a change in the way the relationships between magazines and publishers worked in once you moved to multi-format?
Yeah, it was interesting. At that point, you began to have companies that, might have a lot riding on a particular big name release. And those guys were often more worried about how we were going to treat their game than the console people. Because, those console manufacturers, they had big Japanese companies behind them. And so, there was that sort of, and most of those guys, particularly in the late 80s, were distributors, not the actual console makers themselves. So there was a little bit less of a sort of a personal pressure. They still wanted to make sure their games did well and sold and all that kind of stuff, but it was a little bit more business to business in terms of sort of the relationship. Whereas with, if I was talking to somebody like System 3 and they'd just put a whole bunch of money into a game, they knew that if that game didn't sell, it could derail the company and even make them bust, And so there was a lot more pressure from them to sort of, they would call us up and sort of say, we know you've had the game for a couple of weeks. What are you going to give it? What kind of a rating are you going to give it? Have you got any questions and that kind of thing? So actually, oftentimes it was the smaller companies that were more difficult to deal with. They wanted our coverage because, we were a big magazine and they knew a good review from us would, make or break a game. And, that's the way. And we call ourselves reviewers. These days we call ourselves influencers. But it was the same mechanic, right? We were influencing the market and they knew that, a big market-leading magazine could add tens or even hundreds of thousands of sales to a product. So they loved and hated us in a way. They hated the fact that we had that kind of power over their product sometimes, but they also loved us when we loved it and did that and made them sales. So it did make for some kind of weird relationship sometimes because people want to be nice to us. Sometimes they would get mad at us, and it made for interesting relationships for sure.
Definitely. Now, you mentioned earlier this added wrinkle of, do we test it? Do we not test the game? And you said the decision, only the best games. But obviously, there's going to be some high profile games that you are not going to test well, that right. You're going to be like, this doesn't live up to the hype or whatever else. And you also had previews of games. So games that had shown up previously in the magazine. So now from an editorial standpoint, from a decision-making standpoint, what to include, what to leave out, how did that play out? And was there pressure for the things that had gotten a lot of advertisement to review them, even if you didn't think that they were going to live up to it from a quality standpoint?
Yeah, actually, that was probably the one exception. If there was a big game out there, and especially if it was bad, we would review it, because it was it was part of the service that we provided, was to, don't buy that game, it's terrible. Buy this one, it's great. And that was the philosophy of the magazine, right? So yes, we would definitely review high profile games. If they're great, it's a win-win. If they're not, it's a win for us because it's a win for our readers, but it's a big lose for the company that published it. And so yeah, that was very, very important to do that. And sometimes we might, for example, be negotiating a cover with somebody, or somebody might call us up with a game idea and a game that they were releasing, and sort of they would be trying to persuade us to do a cover on it. And we had lots of contacts everywhere. So, sometimes even within companies, and we could call them up and say, hey, your marketing team's telling us about this game that you're making. Do you think it's any good or not? And these people would kind of go, yeah, it's all right, actually, or no, because you had these good relationships and they kind of trusted you. And if we sort of heard that, well, actually, that game's not as good as it sounds, we would then we would say, no, you know what, and let that go to the magazine, and let them deal with it, and put it on their cover, and then have that awkward situation where it's like, we've got this big high profile game on the cover, but the reviews kind of going, it's not that great. So yeah, part of that was sort of almost like gamesmanship, right? It's like, yeah, we can kind of mess up some other magazine by thinking that they've got a big scoop here, but actually it's a load of shit.
Well, and obviously there's a lot of predicting going on in that scenario.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of clairvoyance. And here, I mean, this is a little bit away from my normal topics, but I do have to talk about it because there's so many classic games that were reviewed during your period, in this 80s period. What would you say were some of the ones where, in hindsight, the wrong decision was made on the test scores? And
yeah, I mean, you know what? Fortunately, there weren't that many. Probably the biggest one, and I've talked about it before, was a game called Bangkok Nights by System 3, whose products could be all over the shop, and the guys that ran the company, Mark and Adrian Kale, they how can I put it, larger than life personalities, who were quite happy to manipulate the truth and things to get what they wanted. And so we negotiated a cover for this Bangkok Nights game, which is a fighting game with these big characters, and basically, Ollie, the artist that painted the ZZAP covers, painted this cover. We waited for the game. It didn't turn up. We hit deadline. It still hadn't arrived. It eventually arrived several days later. It was not in any way complete, despite System 3 telling us that it was finished. And we kind of reviewed it, and we gave it a good rating. I can't remember exactly what. I can't remember if it was a sizzler or not, but it was up in the 80s. Or possibly 90. I can't remember exactly. And what we should have actually done is just done a preview, left the cover on it, and walked away. But it was my first issue of ZZAP that I'd ever managed. I didn't really quite know what to do, and I just thought, we'd sort of promised the review, and we should do the review, and so we gave it this review based on a basic, a reasonable demo, but with a lot of, when you see that, we're going to change that. This isn't quite finished. And by the way, there's going to be more of this. And of course, me being naive at that point sort of went, oh, okay, I'll trust you. And, not thinking, it's System 3, a bunch of absolute liars when it suits them. And of course, when we saw the final game, a whole bunch of promises they made us were never actually, fixed or delivered on. And so I looked at them and went, oh God, it's probably a 70, late 70s game maybe. certainly not as good as we made it out. And that was probably the biggest one, you know. I mean, and that happened a few times where, you know, we received a game that was perhaps a little bit too early. We were told that it was reviewable. We were told things that would be changed and they weren't. But you know what? It doesn't. That only needs to happen a couple of times before you go, all right, if we hear any of this again, no, it's all, you know, we're not reviewing it. So you learn quick, and certainly that System 3, you know, disaster with Bangkok Nights, massive learning experience. Didn't do anything like that again.
Very good. Now, going back one more time, both ZZAP and computer and video games, how big was the mail order subscription business for UK magazines as opposed to newsstand?
It was almost all newsstands, and again, that was sort of part of the sort of the thing that makes the UK different from America, because in America you've got all these sort of, you can set up deals with the post office so that they, you know, mail stuff cheap, even though the magazine will arrive completely ripped to shreds because it's, you know, the crappiest mail service. But you know, subscribing to a magazine in America was so cheap, you know, a few dollars literally for an entire year. Whereas in the UK, it's like not only are you paying full price for the magazine, but you're paying for premium postage and packaging, and it actually made subscriptions very expensive. So even though we did have some subscriptions, and that was great, there were I can't remember the percentage, but it was a fraction of the newsstand sales. It was almost all newsstand. I think probably at our peak, it's something like we were selling 85,000 magazines, of which about 3,000 were subscriptions.
Wow. Okay, yeah. That is a very small percentage.
Yeah, it really was.
Gotcha. And so I guess that also added to the volatility and the importance of having the most interesting cover that month, or the most interesting headline.
Right.
How big could how big were the fluctuations then in the sell-through rate? Was it?
Well, yeah. So a very important case in point happened with CMVG, which I learned about not long after I joined, which was kind of good. But probably in about I think it was 1982. They did a cover of CMVG that kind of looked like a newspaper cover. It had a headline. They tweaked the logo and made it smaller, and they had like news stories on it and pictures of aliens. But at a glance, it made it look like a newspaper, and the sales of that magazine dropped through the floor because people didn't notice it on the newsstand. They passed it by because they didn't recognize the logo because they changed the color and moved the position and made it smaller, which is like, just don't ever do that to a magazine. But it also looked like a newspaper, so people were like, yeah, it's boring. So literally, you know, 1 month they sold, I forget what it was like something like 35,000 magazines. Then they sold 15,000, and then the issue after that had another cover was back up to its normal circulation. So it's like, people are like reading the magazine regularly and will go out and buy it. You'll always have, you know, additional people that will pick it up because they've seen a cover and they think it looks cool. But if you have a disaster cover that kind of hides the magazine or looks terrible, yeah, it can completely screw you up.
Wow. Okay. So that would be dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now jumping back again, you're doing multi-format. The landscape is very complex. How long are you at computer and video games?
So I joined in 1988 and was basically didn't take me long to become editor of that magazine, and then I ran that magazine as full-time editor until late 1990, at which point I was kind of promoted, became a managing editor, was still kind of looking after computer and video games, but I actually spent much more of my time launching and running Mean Machines magazine, which was Britain's first console magazine dedicated to Sega and Nintendo.
And so that decision to jump into that market, was there any kind of internal study done to make sure that the market had hit critical mass at that point to justify it? How did that work?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I had this big hunch that the console market was just going to explode. I was reading market research at the time, which, was just sort of telling you what was selling and sort of, where interests were perhaps. And so in I can't remember if it was 89 or 1990. Either way, I think it was probably in like 89. I talked to the publisher of Computer and Video Games magazine and just said, look, consoles are going to be a thing. We know it. We can see it in the market data. We need to launch a magazine. He was like, well, we need to test this out properly first. So we did a one-off special, which was branded Computer and Video Games, but actually called The Complete Guide to Consoles, which was a one-off magazine that was just everything you want to know about consoles, all the games, what was out there, how much it was, which machines were worth buying and not. And we had everything in there, all the way back to the original Atari 2600, all the way through to the Mega Drive, which was then the newest thing. Did a limited run. I think it was probably 30,000. That was sort of enough to get it out there, but not too much so that you lose your shirt if it didn't sell. Kids took one look at it and went, oh my God, this is brilliant. This is what we want. And so we were like, great. Okay. So, and then the publisher was like, we just need to make sure. So we did another one and then another one and another one. And each time we did it, we sold more, we got more ads. And, it was clear like, yes, the market is ready for a console magazine. So in October, we launched Mean Machines, printed 30,000 of them, sold out completely. And then over the following months, we began to ramp up the distribution quite conservatively, actually, by about 5,000 issues a month. And we did that to actually drive demand. It was quite a smart move, if I say so myself, because what happened was this Mean Machines magazine became this thing that kids were talking about in playgrounds. Oh, have you seen this magazine? It's all about this consoles and stuff, and it's great, and it's funny, and they say funny things in it. And so kids began to go into their newsagent and say, oh, I want a copy of Mean Machines. Do you have it? And because it was selling out, the newsagents were like, oh, this Mean Machines magazine, I'm being asked about it. Maybe I should buy a couple more next month because I can sell them. And so what happened was it sort of, by underprinting a little bit, we created this extra demand so that as we began to print more, the newsagents were like, yes, we'll take them. And what happened was the magazine circulation just went skyrocketed, went crazy. And it didn't take long before we were actually one of the biggest selling magazines in Europe. I think it took about a year maybe. And it was almost, just the right place at the right time, and we rode that wave. But we were very smart in making sure that we were at that right place at the right time by doing our research, which is
Gotcha.
always important.
I mean, it only makes sense now. Talking about research, with the computer games, you mentioned earlier that there was you were getting some news out of Japan, what was happening, and so forth. Obviously, once you move to consoles, especially at this time period, it's Sega and Nintendo, two Japanese companies. Most of the really big titles are coming out of Japan. How did you guys, and I'm guessing you don't speak Japanese, at least not at that point. So how are you guys accessing that information? Was there an additional layer of outside freelancers or some other system set up in order to be able to get that information before you had to wait for local distributors to give it to you about upcoming games and new developments?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, late 80s, there was no internet. There was, nothing. And Japan was the other side of the world. And, it was just like this mystery. Nobody knew about Japan, really. Nobody was really, even talking about it. We just knew that it was this, these new consoles were coming and there was all these cool new games coming out. So, as somebody was sort of in London at the time in an office, I was and wanting to find out more about Japan, I began to look through the telephone book to find out, where I could get more information from Japan, and I realized that actually there was a Japanese bookstore that had just opened up fairly near the offices where our magazines were based. And so, I'll pop round to this Japanese bookstore at lunchtime and just see what's there. I'm interested, in the culture anyway. They're just, these games are coming out, these consoles, and it's like, I'll find more out about Japan. It's all so exciting. So I went into this bookstore, and it was books and music and loads and loads of magazines. So I was, picking up the motorbike magazines, going, holy crap, look at all these Japanese motorcycles I've never seen before, and the cars, and then right at the end of the section was a whole bunch of computer game magazines, Famitsu, and I picked it up, looked at it, started reading through, couldn't understand a word of it, but I could certainly understand the pictures, and it's like, oh, look at this console, these games. And so I just bought an armful of these magazines, took them back to the office, and we started going through them. And eventually we got a very young, he was a school kid actually, and he'd come to the office to just visit and say hello. He was over here with his dad, who was, Japanese family, and that he I forget which company his dad was working at, but he'd been moved out to the UK from Japan, so he'd brought his family with him. And so this kid was, going to this Japanese school fairly close to where the magazine's offices were, and he just came in and said hello one day. Literally, we got this phone call from reception. There's a young lad that wants to see people, and we didn't have that many visitors to the office, so we went down, had a chat with him. Took one look at him and said, "Oh, do you speak Japanese?" And he was like, "Yeah, of course, I'm, Japanese and English." And we were like, "Yoink!" Took him up to the office, put these magazines in front of him, and said, "What does that say? What does this say? What's this game?" And he told us, and we're like, "You need to come back more often." And he became our translator. So I would go down every other week. Well, in fact, I was going down there multiple times a week, to see if there was new magazines there, because it was always exciting getting a new magazine from Japan and seeing what was in there. And that's how we found out about all of these games and stuff, because they were all in those magazines. And so we would translate their news stories, cut the pictures out of the magazine and stick them in our own magazine, just basically completely copying them, because at that point it's like these Japanese magazine publishers, they probably don't even know we exist, and they certainly don't know our magazine. So and they don't have offices in Europe, so they're not going to sue us, so we'll just steal their stuff. And that's what we did.
Absolutely phenomenal. I got to ask, how much did this kid get for translating this stuff at that point?
Oh, God. You know what? I have no idea. I think we just gave him tons and tons of games. He would be able to. He's actually on Twitter. I still talk to him occasionally. He went back to Japan, has become a lounge singer, and he tours Japan. I think he plays instruments, and he sometimes plays with the lady that sings like songs for the Final Fantasy series. So it's all kind of really interesting. This lounge singer and this very lovely lady that he plays with, and they go to different venues. He posts pictures on Twitter, so it's a really nice. His name's George Nagata, and he's a really nice chap. And that's what he does, and he posts pictures of his kids and stuff. So it's funny. I don't keep in touch with a lot of the old Mean Machines guys, but through social media I've been able to keep in touch with him. So that's really cool, even though he's over the other side of the world. It's nice to sort of still see him and what he's doing.
Oh, that's phenomenal. Okay, so you're getting your news this way, and I do have to ask, I mean, are you when you're gathering all this information, when you want to put the magazine together, reviews are, of course, the lifeblood of the magazine, but previews are what are giving you, you know, the headlines on the front cover. And please correct me at any time if I'm getting any of these assumptions of mine wrong. How are you guys dividing up the tasks inside the staff? I mean, do you have people who are just doing reviews? Do you have people who are just running around going to studios and publishers to try to get those scoops? How does that work?
Yeah, it's interesting, actually. I mean, the thing is, and a lot of people don't really, you know, necessarily understand that. Or they do if they read the magazine's masthead. But actually, you know, most magazines had tiny staff. You know, Mean Machines, we had like 4 people doing all of the writing and editing and everything. And so there wasn't really, it's not like we were sort of had beats like tradition, like a big newspaper. It's like, you know, I do the cooking column and this person does politics and that, you know, that sort of thing. No, you were expected to do everything because you never knew what, you know, one minute you might be writing news stories. I might be writing a news story because I've just found out about something. People are reviewing, previewing. They might be going off site. They might be doing a visit to an arcade to do a report. It was all very fluid. The only way that sort of tasks were really sort of divided was more kind of I don't know how to kind of categorize it really, but I did all the editing. I was the final word in terms of sort of, you know, every piece of written text in the magazine went through me. So that was the most important part of my role, was just making sure that all the text was edited and done, the pages were organized, and everything was being sent off. So sort of that organization thing, that was on me. Whereas a junior staff writer, their tasks would be things like going through 800,000 competition entries to judge the winner, or read mailbags full of kids' letters and picking out the best ones and typing them up so I could write the responses. So we had somebody else that, you know, was, you know, in charge of making sure all the games were being photographed. So we did sort of have, you know, responsibilities that they weren't necessarily assigned by skill, but more kind of like level of, you know, kind of what level you were at and your experience within the company. So, you know, obviously we wouldn't want some young, inexperienced staff writer, you know, managing the games and stuff. You know, that would be one of the senior guys. The junior guy would have to pay his dues and do basically all the crappy work. You know, we all did it. I did it when I first started. Everybody does it. You know, that's how you learn, right? You go through the basics and you work your way up.
Gotcha. Now, you're at CVG until which year?
So I was at EMAP, which was the publisher, until the end of 1993. So I was at CMVG. I ran that from 88 to 90, and then Mean Machines for a couple of years until 92. Then we split Mean Machines into Mean Machines Sega and the official Nintendo magazine. And then I run all of that until I left the UK in December 1993.
Gotcha. Now, I do have to ask, because if I'm not mistaken, CVG drops the 8-bit microcomputers around the time that you were still there.
Yeah.
Now, that must have been an interesting decision to make. I mean, was it, okay, we're just cutting it here, or you just realized slowly that there weren't any interesting games worth wasting pages on?
Yeah, it was a combination of a whole bunch of things. You know, obviously we have our finger very much on the pulse of the readership, because every month they send us letters. So, you know, we just knew where readers' interests were, because they were talking about consoles all the time, non-stop, all the questions, consoles. We'll know about consoles. This is coming out on console. And so we were getting almost no letters about the 8-bit computers. We also could see the fact that the dedicated 8-bit computer magazines were just dying. You know, they'd sort of become little thin pamphlets with a free game on the front. So we knew that the market was gone. And, plus we were always talking to the manufacturers, and, they would just sort of say, oh, that last Spectrum game, we made, we published 40,000 of them and they sold 3, and so we had all of that. There was all this data that, we had access to. So we just knew that, it was on its way out. So it was kind of like a natural thing. It's not like we sort of just went 1 month, all right, we're stopping this. We could just say it just wasn't exciting for our readers. And we just knew that, I can't even remember the sort of the last 8-bit game that we reviewed, but there was just one day where we just didn't do it anymore because there wasn't anything worth doing, So given a choice between a 1992 Spectrum game and say, some the Super Mario World, it's like, yep, that's a no-brainer.
So you're not going to be covering Street Fighter 2 on the Sinclair Spectrum because, anything on the Genesis. Okay.
Right.
Okay, so now you've launched Mean Machines. You oversee the split of Mean Machines. Why do you leave publishing at that point? Correct?
Yeah, I do.
Now, what leads to that change of role in the industry?
Yeah, it was interesting actually. It's another sort of political thing in a way. We had this great Nintendo magazine, the official Nintendo magazine, working with Nintendo, who were always a pain in the arse, but nevertheless, we worked with them. We made a great magazine, and we had a good deal with them. Actually, very unusual for Nintendo. I mean, they basically, they relinquished the editorial freedom in terms of reviews to us, and because we persuaded them, it made sense because basically we explained to them, you do one review that somebody buys a game and they kind of go, this is a bit off. You lose their trust. If that happens again, they won't buy the magazine because there are another 50 out there. And if they don't trust, magazine is all about trust and credibility. If your magazine is not trustworthy or credible, nobody's going to buy it. End of story. It only takes them to, just $30 on a cartridge and they hate you because that's important. And I knew, and as I've said, growing up, I knew how important that was because that same thing that happened to me. So we'd basically said to Nintendo, you've got to let us have that sort of that range of reviews because you're going to sell games. You're going to sell games. Isn't it better for us to at least recommend them? Kids buy the good games that they will like and want to buy more of them than you telling us to give this game a good rating, kids buying it and thinking this is crap, tanking the credibility of your magazine and also of your company because you're associated with this magazine. So they went, yeah, that totally makes sense. So we had that editorial freedom. So that was really good, on the Nintendo magazine, and then on the Mean Machines Sega, we had a great relationship with Sega, and that the magazine just was selling huge. And so by sort of mid 1993, I'm looking at the market again and kind of going, I think that there's a group of older gamers that are sort of coming up that are a bit more adult. They don't really want to read the sort of the 12-year-old, sort of jokey, funny, that funny humor is always important. Being entertaining is, to me, is very important. But it was, Mean Machines was quite kiddie, and I just thought, I think there's room in the market for a new kind of adult focused magazine, which is funny because at the same time, Future were thinking the same thing, and my old workmate Steve Jarrett was thinking the same thing, and he produced Edge, which we all know about, very popular magazines, one of the few magazines still going, great reputation, all the rest of it. And and it was, when it launched, it was very unusual. It was beautifully designed, adult speaking, very straight magazine. So I kind of wanted to do the same thing because I recognized the same market the version I would have done would have probably been a bit funnier and a bit more irreverent, but it would have been the same thing. It's like a magazine aimed at sort of, people over 16, basically. So I did a bunch of research, put together a dummy, and EMAP basically turned it down in favor of another terrible idea that they lost hundreds of thousands of pounds on, that I don't need to go into, but it was a really dumb move. And once they turned down that magazine, I was like, I'm bummed out. I don't want to keep doing the same thing that I've been doing for the last 5 years. I want to do something different. And it just happened that I went on assignment to the States, to Virgin Games, who had just had a huge cash investment from Hasbro and a couple of other companies, and they'd set up this big studio. Were making all these video games, so I went out there to sort of see the studio and do a report on them. And while I was there, I was looking at their games, and over the years, whenever I've been sort of looking at pre-release games, I've always thought it was sort of useful to sort of, at the very least, give a bit of feedback on it. This looks good. I think people will like that. This is not so good. What are you going to, and asking questions and sort of, giving a bit of review feedback so that the manufacturer might have an idea of, what's good and what's not bad about it, or even what they might change to make it better. So I was doing that at Virgin, kind of a couple of games. Oh, this is good, but these controls are terrible. Why don't you do this? And so I was doing this for a couple of hours, and the person there who kind of ran the studio, David Bishop, he was listening to me sort of talking, and after a while he just said, would you be interested in coming over here and doing that for us full time? And I kind of went, I don't know. But I've been to America a bunch of times in the previous years, and I loved America. And I kind of thought, wow, it would definitely be really interesting to move out here. And so I sort of thought about it. Anyway, a week later, after giving it some serious thought and talking with my then wife, I said, well, okay. I kind of like the idea of this. What would it entail? And he just said, look, we'll pay for you to come out here. We'll move you. You don't, we'll give you the green card and all the rest of it. Just come out here and work for us. And I just thought, sure, why not? I'll give it a go. Something different. It's a little bit of a break from doing magazines. And I thought, if anything, getting the chance to work in development is going to give me some really different, unique perspectives that I've never had before. And so off I went. A few months later, I moved to Southern California and was working at Virgin. Sort of eventually became the VP of Design and Acquisition. So it was my job to kind of look at all the games from a critical standpoint and sort of, tell people what they might expect the reception from gamers and reviewers would be, and what they might need to change it if we were worried the reception might be negative. But I was also looking at all of the different games and things that were submitted to Virgin, like the concepts or demos and stuff like that, and picking the best demos and presenting them to the board so that they could sign up new products. So that's what I ended up doing after about 3.5 years at Virgin.
Interesting. I'm a little surprised you guys were still getting demos. Now, were these, still lone programmers sending in demos at this point? Were they people trying to get jobs or people actually pitching a product?
It was everything. We would get submissions from toy manufacturers. Hey, we're launching this new line of toys. What do you think? Could you make a game out of this? We had comic book makers. At one point, I was working with Neil Adams to develop characters for a superhero game, which is one of my favorite sort of bits of working at Virgin. Neil Adams, huge comic book fan, loved Neil Adams stuff as a kid, and so to actually get to chance to work with him, and he's dead now, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But one of the nicest people I've ever worked with. Such a lovely guy. He was great.
As a fellow comic book geek and somebody who actually did have a 10-minute conversation with him once at a con, please tell me the whole Neil Adams story if you don't mind. Please regale me.
Yeah, so he had his little comic book company that he was. So this was, obviously, mid '90s. So he'd had that I forget what the name of the comic books, but he had a series of comic books that he'd made, and he just literally sort of called me up out of the blue, said who he was, and I was like, literally like, the Neil Adams, like the actual Neil Adams that did Batman and stuff, and he was like, yeah. I was like, holy crap, he's talking to me, and he started telling me about his comics, and I went, yeah. I know you do comics. What do you want? And he's just like, well, he didn't really have much of a game idea, but he's like, I think it would be really fun to work with a video game company to develop some kind of a superhero game, and I could design the characters for it. And at that time, that sort of thing just wasn't happening very often, where you'd get a really famous person that was like, I want to work with video games. Of course, in the decade since, video games have become a thing that people really want to work with. But at that time, video games were still a bit funky. So, it was quite unusual to have somebody of that caliber sort of saying that. And I was just like, sure, great. So he came to Virgin, for a meeting. We sat there and brainstormed ideas and just talked about things. And so he began to develop a set of characters. Unfortunately, probably about a month into the project, he got a contract to work on. It was a very high profile project. I think it was a Batman project and something else at DC. And he just called me up and said, "Look, this has been fun, but I can't spend any more time on this." And I was like, "That's fine." It was just concept stuff. I had some drawings. We'd sort of talked about sort of ideas about what we might do with the game. But his drawings were fantastic. His ideas were brilliant, and it was just a pleasure to actually be able to work with him and sit down and hear his tales about what it was like working at DC and how he did his art and what inspired him and all that kind of stuff. And that was fantastic. So we would have things like that, and we also had little independent programming teams that might put together a basic demo, and it's like, we would like you to publish it. Here's our demo. Give us the money so we can staff up and make it. And occasionally we'd have one of the remaining kind of lone programming little maybe a small team of people that are producing some smaller game that could be exciting and stuff. But we had and reviewed everything you could possibly think of in terms of sort of IP submissions at Virgin.
Interesting. Now, Virgin at this point, obviously originally a UK company, and they had or were you there when, by the time you get there, Dune 2 is already launched, correct? Or is it still in the pipeline?
You know what? It was still happening.
Okay. So there was more and more development happening in the States that Virgin was publishing. Was there a real shift towards moving the company primarily to the States, or what was the long-term planning when you got there for Virgin?
Well, it was interesting, really, because what had happened was that Virgin had become very successful with Sega, off the back of Sega, and they also owned Mastertronic, and it was all part of the same group, so they had a lot of money. So they set up a division in the States, and then they had a huge cash injection from Hasbro, who invested very heavily in them. And they used that money in the States to set up a dedicated studio that was absolutely cutting edge. I mean, I remember arriving there in the very beginning of 1994. They had a massive network that was, terabytes, which at that time was just like, oh my God, Star Trek Enterprise size, and digital music studios at a time when there was still brand new video facilities that were all digital. I mean, they spent millions and millions and millions. They also hired very talented and quite expensive people to sort of put on all these new projects. But the problem was that they didn't have anybody really in command of the studio. So it was, you know, you had head of music, head of video, producers, executive producers, you know, lead programmers, and everybody had different ideas about what to do. And because you had no real leader, everything became very sort of political and disorganized. And not only that, but unfortunately, the producers they hired weren't especially good at sort of really judging the workload. So you had all these very, very ambitious games in development, and nobody was saying, okay, you've got this this very cool open world game based on a Clive Barker property, but it's taken one artist almost a week to create a few things that fit in one of the hundreds of rooms in this game. Shit, we're not going to be able to do this on time, if ever. And unfortunately, that was true of almost everything. There was this cartoon point and click adventure called Toonstruck that was unbelievably good, incredibly clever, very cool property, but it was almost impossible to produce because there was just so much in it. So what happened was the studio began to lose money, and when it did, it lost tons of money and at one point I think it was costing $1 million. I forget if it was $1 million a week or a month. I mean, it could well have been a week, but it was, you know, cash was just draining out there because nobody was making products, and Virgin was paying for this unbelievably expensive studio that had probably 8 big AAA games in development that were just not happening.
Oh, wow. And your position there, I mean, you were still doing the same thing that you did originally, which was take a look at the product at intermittent stages and then basically just give advice on how to proceed with it?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up walking away from the studio. You know, it'd become very political, and so we had the internal development team. So what I ended up doing is actually working with the external development team, with all of the external games that we had in production. So I applied my role to that, which was better suited. And actually, interestingly, in the UK, the UK still didn't have really a development studio. It was all third-party products. And so not only did it become this sort of third-party product publisher, but it also it became a distributor as well. So it did deals with people like Capcom and other big companies to publish their American games in the States. So in a way, and so you can imagine the politics of this. You had the UK, big successful distribution, third-party producer, banging out products, making millions. And then in the States, you had this clown show studio costing an absolute fortune, losing money, crazy amounts of money. I was in meetings. I remember being in one meeting where the financial guys we kind of need to hide $27 million of losses and figure out a way of pushing it into the next quarter. At which point I was just sitting there going like, are we all going to fricking go to jail? Because, you know, this is just atrocious. I can't believe I'm hearing this. You know, at the time, particularly, I was, you know, just come out of magazines where, you know, spending £5,000 on a promotion was a big thing, and hearing like $27 million, like shit, you could buy a hospital with that, and that's the losses, and they're trying to hide it from our corporate people. By which time, with the Blockbuster Viacom big corporate group, and this went on for another year or so until somebody at Viacom finally went, we've looked at the numbers and there were a few discrepancies, at which point it just all unraveled, and within a year Virgin was sold off to EA. Just
wow.
A disaster. Massive. Talk about, you know, lessons learned, a lot of sort of takeaways from that. But yeah, you know, it was just like, wow, that's not how to do business.
Now, when it gets sold to EA, are you still with the company? Do you get taken over by EA, or?
Yeah, I'm still at the company, and I am hanging on for dear life because there was this sort of weird period where I was still waiting for my green card to come through, and the sort of the way it works is, if you go and work for a company in the States, you are attached to that company. If your job at that company disappears, you're gone. You're out of the country, unless you can persuade another company to give you a visa and do all of that. And none of that happens quickly. So basically, it's like literally you've got 2 weeks to leave. It can be devastating. I'm seeing it happen to people, and it's horrible. And so I'm there sort of thinking, like, is Virgin going to go bust before I get my green card? Is it going to be sold to EA, and is that going to invalidate my green card, or what? But fortunately, like literally just as Virgin was about to be sold off, my green card went through. The immigration, the sort of immigration services, they and they rubber stamped it and said, yep, you now have a green card, which meant that I was then able to. That was like an independent green card. I can go and work anywhere. So when Virgin collapsed, I was on the phone looking for my next job, which was in the States, fortunately.
Very cool. Now, and before we leave Virgin, because Virgin is working, for example, with Westwood, with the Corandia games, and like you said, Toonstruck, game that I enjoyed immensely back in the day. It was, just insane. What happened, or how many other projects, just ballpark figure, were in some stage of development when the company went bust, and how many of them were being developed internally versus externally?
Difficult to say. I mean, they had a whole bunch of different cool things on the go when Virgin kind of just went under. Probably the most notable ones. There was a game called Subspace, and that was an online game. Very, very, very unusual. Very early online game. It was it's almost like sort of asteroids or space war in a sort of in an area, and you could fly around and shoot things and shoot at other people, and there were little bases and things. But it was online, and that actually was functional. So that was a really, really cool thing. And I don't know whatever happened to it. I think it just went away. It was. It was so advanced at the time. I think, people were like, I can't make it commercially viable, but that was cool. And then, there was sort of a couple of movie properties being developed, if I remember. And the games that sort of hadn't come out yet, that had been in development for 3 years, like Toonstruck. They were still trying to work with the assets to turn it into a game. And, a couple of others. But it's one of those things where projects had started to be shut down as Virgin realized that they were just not going to happen throughout the prior year. So it's not like everything was going full tilt and suddenly everything got shut down. It was, over the previous year, teams of people have been laid off. We'd had rounds and rounds and rounds of redundancies, and so by the time we reached mid 1997, that Virgin was probably a third, if that, the size of what it was when I first joined. So it was a sort of a fairly long, drawn out collapse, even though the end was sudden.
Gotcha. Okay, so you've just been picked up by EA. You finally get your green card, so you no longer have to be worried about being tied to one company. What does EA want to do with you?
I didn't care because I was out of there as soon as I got my green card, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I'd been messing about with online stuff for years beforehand. Basically, like as soon as I moved to Southern California, and I found out about this thing called America Online, went online. Yeah, I bought a laptop, went online, and I'd been on the internet by this time for 3 years, and was super into it. I was just like, this is the shit. This is going to do something incredible, and I have to be there and do it. So so I'd sort of started nosing around, and I knew that obviously I'd been looking for sort of exits out of Virgin to sort of where could I go next if I did get where would I go, and the Imagine Games Network in San Francisco, which was basically it was run by Chris Anderson, the guy that hired me at ZZAP, so he knew me, and he knew that I'm not crap. And so I called him up and just said, you got this cool magazine company in San Francisco, you're doing stuff, you got a job for me? And he just, he's paused for a second and went, well, funny you should say that, but I've got this little group of websites that are sort of based on a bunch of my magazines, and I kind of need somebody to do something with them. And I said, well, I'm your man. I'm put me on a plane. I'll be up to San Francisco next week, and we can talk about what we can do. So I hopped on the plane, flew up to San Francisco, went over to Imagine's office in Brisbane and South San Francisco, and we had a chat, and it immediately was like, yeah, you've got some really good ideas about online. You've got a handle on it, like, wow, this is really cool. So he just, yep, you're hired. And so within a few weeks, I packed all my stuff up in my car, drove from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and started working with online publications. And and it was interesting at that time because it's really, in fact, it blows my mind looking back at it, sort of how people looked at it. Because when I joined what we turned into IGN.com, the biggest video game website on the planet, it was this, like I said, it was a group of different little websites that were based on Imagine's magazine. So there was like the PlayStation magazine website, and what else there? An N64 website, and another one based on Game Players magazines. And basically, all the guys on the magazine were like, "Internet's fucking shit. We don't like it. We think it's crap." And so what they did was they put their sort of their most junior guy on the website and told them to, literally copy stuff out of the magazine and paste it on the website, after the magazines come out. And you had a few guys that were sort of doing little bits of news and things, and sort of trying to make the property their own, but they were getting no support or anything. So I sort of came along and looked at this and went, why on earth are people being told to post magazine stuff online like a month after the magazines come out? So this news is like 3 months old, and this is online. You can write something and post it, and it's instant. You can win the news easy. This is no problem. And not only that, you can probably win reviews and stuff like that and get them up and online before the magazines come out. And that's why people want to read online, because they get the information instantly. So fortunately I had the support of the Simon Whitcomb, who was basically what would become IGN. He was the publisher, and he was sort of running the business unit. I was the lead editorial guy, and I sort of remember having that conversation with him, and he was just like, totally, but he wants his business unit to succeed, right? But he wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I had this solution, and then we had to politic all the magazine people and say, yeah, well, what we're going to do actually is we're going to turn these websites into their own thing and give them their own identity, so they can stand on their own 2 feet. Let the people write editorial for them, which will be different from the magazine, and we'll run it as a unit. So there was a little bit of pushback on that from some of the people that were like, well, we like the idea of the sort of the brand extension online, but most of them are just like, whatever, sure, we don't really care. This internet thing is just not something that we think is particularly great. They just weren't into it. So of course,
now I gotta ask. Obviously, we're dealing 1997.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't had the implosion of online ad revenue yet. You're still actually in the upward spiral.
Oh, this was pre-bubble. This was 4 years pre-bubble. This was where the bubble actually started, right there.
Exactly.
Yeah. because we started publishing stuff, and because we were one of the first video game publications on the web, we rebranded IGN to give its own identity and allow it to stand on its own 2 feet. We had this editorial team that was producing bespoke editorial that you couldn't read anywhere else. Of course, we got thousands and thousands of people, coming to us, and at that point, people were going online, hundreds of thousands of new people every week were buying, computers and modems and all the rest of it. It was a huge explosion. And basically what we did, we had that as a basis. And we kind of thought, maybe what we also do is identify other cool websites that have a good, readership. And we will use our ad department to sell ads on their sites and bring them into our network. And of course, because they're in their network, that counted to your traffic. And within a year, we peaked, actually. We were the 27th biggest website on the planet, which, actually is unbelievable. Because at that point, we were like bigger than BBC, Disney, you name it. The people above us were like Excite, Yahoo, and those big players. And then IGN was, which for at the time, a video game website. Unbelievable that we were the 27th biggest property on the planet. But it's because we had a huge network of all these different cool niche sites, sort of blues news or PC news, or we had the game facts, the sort of all of the hints and tips and stuff. So all of these things just added to the network and just made it this massive property.
I still remember for years, movies.ign.com was my go-to in the mornings. Yeah. So I do have to ask now, because, and you talked about this earlier, the difference between the American magazine publishing and the European magazine publishing. And the Americans were all about, we finance the whole damn thing with advertisement.
Mm-hmm.
And your background up to this point, because you hadn't done U.S. magazine publishing yet, your background was, we make our money off of selling it. How was the jump for you in recalibrating to it's going to be advertising based for this original content, and how did the calculation work? How much could you spend on content? And how did the calculation as opposed to the revenue and so forth work? And were there any thoughts of alternative revenue models other than advertising?
Yeah, it was a tricky one, actually, because the interesting thing was, because it was online, it was a very different environment. So actually it took me a little while to really understand like why the American magazines were like they were. But it was sort of one of those things where you kind of figure a couple of things out, and all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. It's like, oh, you only sell 30% of your magazines? Holy shit, how do you make money? Well, off the advertising, of course. How else would you make money? Well, because in Europe, we sell freaking millions of magazines and make money off that. Oh, then that's why you guys are like you are, because you're shit scared of your advertisers pulling your revenue, because they if they did that, you'd go under. And so there was a sort of a series of realizations, and it was like, that's why American publications are the way they are. With IGN, it was a very odd thing, because with IGN, it was a very odd thing because it was so new. Nobody really quite knew, what was working and what wasn't. As long as the revenue was coming in, we were fine. So we would, try different things, different ad placements. Ads were nowhere near as invasive as they were now. So, and I was, somebody was just like, no, you're not putting a freaking advert there. You can put it up there, as a sort of lead editorial guy. And they would actually listen to me, these days, no chance of that. They just, we'll just put a big video right over the thing you're reading and not even let you close it so you can see the thing underneath. I mean, the editorial landscape is abysmal online now. I can't believe how bad it is. But yeah, back then it was a lot nicer, and there was a lot more room for the editorial, and the ads had their place and stayed there. And even though we later, tried messing around with subscription models and that sort of thing, it was the ad revenue that was, ad placement thing that drove the money.
Gotcha. Was this also the reason? Because one of the things that I remember from IGN articles back in the day was you would read to a certain point and then you'd have to click to get to the next page.
Oh, I remember that the very day when I went, we were sitting there and basically Simon, the publisher, was like, we need to get a bit more money out of this thing. And I just sort of sat there and I went, hang on a sec, you serve an ad per page. If we just put the same article across 2 pages, you get double the revenue. And he was like, oh, so yeah, basically.
Yeah. For people like me who try to go through the old articles for historical purposes, that is the bane of my existence, because those old articles are not on archive.org, or at least only the first pages. But obviously this wasn't something you guys were worried about. But
No. Preservation? No, it's internet. Here today.
Exactly. So that is an interesting question, because obviously in the magazine business, you're always worried about month to month. You don't really care. I mean, well, you care to a certain extent. I mean, a lot of the magazines would, print out the list of previously reviewed games or rehash that material again and again. Was the fact that all of the material that IGN had produced in the past still accessible, was that a consideration in the business model?
Yes and no. I mean, we always assumed it would just always be there. It's like it's saved, it's online, it's always going to be there. We didn't really think, for example, when we changed the server technology and the way that the site worked, that bits of the data would be lost, or certain things might go away, and or we couldn't attribute a certain article with the author because the author's name's not that's been lost in the data somewhere. So yeah, that's sort of something that we didn't think about initially, and only became apparent later. That was like, yeah, kind of archiving everything and making sure that it's always there is a lot more difficult than it first seemed.
Gotcha. And now, how long were you at IGN?
4 years.
4 years. Now, in that time period, we also start to see the rise of streaming video.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how did that change? Obviously, things like game trailers and whatnot would be a factor. But was there already a movement during your time there for IGN to start producing its own video or audio content?
Yes, I mean, definitely at the point where I left, it was just beginning to go that way. We were like, yeah, I'd read a bunch of market research that was sort of predicting kind of public bandwidth capabilities. So the idea being that the adoption of cable internet is going to create this kind of bandwidth, which will allow people to do these kinds of things. This is where it's going to be in the country. This is the likely adoption rate. So we began to see like, yeah, that bandwidth is going to really open up, and video is going to become a thing, because in the previous. God, I can't even remember. I mean, I think it was maybe 1998 or 1999. I had the people that eventually did the streaming game service. It wasn't Ouya, it was the other thing. God, I can't remember what the
Steam Deck.
It was a game streaming service from 2010, around that area.
Oh yeah, I remember. They had some dinosaur game that was like the demo. Now I can't think of it. I tried using it once and could never get through properly to the server.
Yeah, they had. It was actually just around on live. That's I just had to.
On live, yeah.
Yeah, that was on live. Yeah, on live, or some of the people that were on live approached IGN, and I remember talking to them about 1999. It could have been 2000. It was about that time, and they were talking about game streaming, and they had this tech, and they showed us a demo, and I remember looking at it, going like, "Holy fucking crap! I did not know anything like this was possible." And it wasn't really possible back then, but they had a proof of tech that worked, as a demo across a network, and they were just like, once the bandwidth opens up, this will work for games. I'm like, wow. So we knew that sort of thing was coming, and we'd had any number of people, sort of talking to us about video streaming services, and at that point it was still developers that were making compression systems that were good enough to keep the video consistent. And so even though the video was at that time was still quite low res, people were developing the compression routines to sort of take advantage of the tech then, so that we could start streaming stuff. So by that time, we'd had a few things on IGN that were sort of testing this technology, and it was clear, like, yeah, this internet thing will also become TV at some point. It's not if, it's when it will happen.
Gotcha. Now, another interesting switchover from magazine publishing to online publishing would have been the ability for feedback, both in the form of people writing stuff to you guys, but also in the form of user statistics. How did you guys deal with that information load, and how did it determine or influence business decisions you were making?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking at spreadsheets all the time. Look at people are clicking on this, and then they go here, and then they do that, and then they do this, and they're sort of just trying to figure out like behaviors and what kind of articles makes people click onto the next one versus one that kind of causes them to exit the site. What's what are the factors here? And so, we were looking at all of that stuff, and that played a hugely important role. And at that point, we were obviously getting emails from people because we had email addresses for people to write to, but also we had IGN bought the biggest sort of bulletin board site on the net at that point, which is called the Vault Network, which was a series of boards where about some of the MMOs. So there was one for the biggest one was Asheron's Call, which was a game developed by an early MMO, one of the first ones, by Turbine and produced by distributed by Microsoft. And because there were no sort of external sites for these games or anything like that, the players of that game used the Vault Network to communicate and post messages and to trade items and all this kind of thing. So what we were also seeing basically was the emergence of the sort of social, people talking to one another and communicating using what was then bulletin boards, and eventually we had Twitter and all that other stuff, and that sort of created the modern social media system. But back then that was the primary way that people would communicate. You get these communities on these bulletin boards that would talk, and and it was the Wild West initially. I mean, I had to write a terms of service when we bought the Vault Network because they didn't have one. So, and I remember writing the terms of service and posting it, and people going absolutely insane. Like, who the fuck are you? This is our, freedom of, all the usual stuff, freedom of speech, and that's literally sort of, when a business thinks you're misbehaving and kicks you out of the store, same shit. We're a store, and if we don't like the way you're behaving, you're getting kicked out. So we went through all of that in 2000, and it was again massive learning experience, because really from that I learned all about sort of the early online behavior, trolling, people being dicks to one another, how horrible people were to each other, racism, lot of homophobia, and all that kind of stuff, and sort of politics and things, and all this sort of stuff that was coming up on the on these bulletin boards. But it was like, oh yeah, I can see the way this is going to go, and it's not going to be pretty. And here we are today, and it isn't, frankly. I mean, a lot of social media really does suck.
Yeah, and more, yeah. Sorry, I live in Germany for a reason. Now, okay, so I have to. Okay, so you're getting all this data about traffic to the sites. Obviously, IGN is also spreading out. I mean, like I said, the movies side, there's a comics side, all of these different ones, and you obviously also have to decide how many resources or how much money to allocate to each of the sites based off of their off of what they're generating. Is this being? I mean, you said you're looking at spreadsheets all the time. What does that look like for the staff? I mean, is the staff being spread out across these different sites? Can you use a game reviewer to suddenly do a movie review? How does that diversification suddenly work inside the company?
Yeah, I mean, while magazines, people had to do all sorts of stuff. IGN was a traditional newsroom. It's like the movie guys, about movies, you work on the movie site. The car guy, yeah, you're the car guy. N64, you're the Nintendo guy. Yeah, everybody had a very specific role. And, people hopped from maybe, the PlayStation site to the Nintendo site or to the Saturn or whatever, or Dreamcast. But it was sort of, it was a one-step move, and that's where you stayed. So it was, a lot more compartmentalized. And the other thing that was actually happening, which was, the really big thing, was not only has IGN become this big thing, Chris Anderson, had sort of seen all of these IPOs that were happening with other properties and just said, we're spinning IGN off, bought in this guy. Imagine Media also had a sort of the female equivalent of IGN called Chick Click. They had a very early, and it could have been massive, but wasn't, unfortunately, but a sort of it was called the Power Students Network. And it was basically almost like what Zuckerberg did with Facebook. It was a way for students to communicate with one another, connect depending on their universities, and even little businesses to advertise. And it was kind of creating these what were basically sort of proto social media sites based around universities and university students. So somebody was brought in to basically put all of this stuff together in a package and to take it to IPO. And it was a horrible idea, terrible, just, putting three completely wrong things together. I was told to go out and kind of sell this as kind of the lead editorial guy. And so I spent months traveling around America, talking to venture capitalists who this time were very leery of the millions of IPOs that were going on, and and would ask very difficult questions about the business model, which I kind of was sometimes able to answer. But a lot of them were like, nah, I can see this isn't going to be particularly good. And I knew it wasn't going to be good either. It's horrible to sort of have to, sell something you don't believe in. I believed in IGN. It's like, yeah, that's a property that can do its thing. It's got a massive audience. But sort of tacking these two other things on that don't fit, that's not going to make some magical Yahoo network, which is basically what, I was being told to sell it at, and the other executives were also sort of selling. And so, when the IPO finally happened, it was actually one of the last IPOs as the dot-com bubble burst. It went out, it kind of tanked, but sort of not. It just didn't make any money. And once they realized that it wasn't going to work as a going concern, they got rid of all of the bits that sort of and kept IGN. and it bumped along for a few years. They sold it to Fox, and eventually, it sort of found its way and became what it is now. But not without a lot of politics and drama.
Too bad. Now, so after you did the IPO roadshow, how much longer were you at the company?
Not that much longer. Here's the thing. I mean, I'd been in the boardroom for months saying this is a stupid idea. It ain't gonna work. It ain't gonna work. And of course, when it did, nobody wants somebody who basically said, "I told you so." Working for them anymore, because I'm just sitting there going like, "You fucked it up," and it's so I was sort of laid off as in one of the last rounds of layoffs after we'd sort of restructured IGN and put everything together. I was very bitter about it, to be honest, because I'd worked my arse off, with the rest of the team. We'd all worked incredibly hard. We created this IGN thing, and if they'd launched it as its own thing at the time, I think it would have actually gone really well. But instead, they got greedy. They waited about a year too long, and it was. And by the time it went out, people just not into the idea of investing heavily in the web anymore, because we'd had all sorts of IPOs that had crashed and burned. So it just got kind of messed up, and I was completely burnt out at that time, because IGN was crazy, very political, all sorts of stress and arguments and dealing with crazy people and stuff, and so I just burnt out, and I actually ended up spending, a good few years out of the industry. I was just like, I need to take a break from games completely and just sort of rethink, kind of the business I want to get into. And since I've, learned a lot about online, the thing that I really felt was important was like, I think online retail and sales is going to become massive, very important. So that's what I wanted to learn about. So I spent some time at Walmart.com, because I thought, what better place to learn about retail sales than the world's biggest retailer, who is just the worst company you could possibly ever imagine working for. Awful, horrible company with awful philosophies, and they want you to sing this company song and love what you do, and it's just like, nah, I'm not that kind of a person, and I hate that shit. So but I did learn an unbelievable amount of good stuff while I was there, about
and the
how
company
online
song.
Retail was. And the company. Oh god. And then after that, I spent some time at an ad agency, which I thought was probably good. I just wanted to beef up my marketing skills, because I had good editorial skills. And it's like, I know editorial. I now know about sort of retail and, sort of how sales work. If I do a bit of advertising, on the ground, I'll learn about advertising and marketing. And then finally, sort of a bit of an aside, but it was kind of fun at the time, I spent a year at Bank of America, helping them produce the first generation online banking service that they launched probably about 5 years later. But that was really interesting, and probably the easiest job I've ever had, one of the best paid jobs I've ever had. But after a year, of sort of dicking about and politicking and with people and stuff, and doing this very strange job, I was just like, no, I'm a creative person. I want to be making stuff. I don't want to be kind of working in an environment that was almost like sort of local government, because it was all about, working with your group of people to politic another group of people to make this thing happen in another part of the company. And it was just like, oh God, just, no, I don't want to just sit in meetings all day, every day, nonstop, which is what I did. I didn't do anything. I just sat there and talked all day. It was very strange sort of existence.
I gotta ask a little bit before we move on about the marketing gig. So, having been at magazines for so many years and IGN, having placed ads, accepted ads from companies, and so forth, did you have? Was there anything that really surprised you once you were in the marketing side of things about how product launch, product or the dissemination of information about product was done from that side that you may not have thought about previously as being on the magazine or website side?
Yeah, it was actually a very, very interesting gig because I went to work at this quite this sort of small ad agency in just over the Golden Gate Bridge in a place called Sausalito in the North Bay, and basically they did all of the marketing for Dell. So they wrote the weekly catalogs and the monthly catalogs that they mailed out. We did the radio ads, newspaper ads, occasionally looked at TV ads, but we did all of that stuff. And so because I'd been on the because I've been on magazines, they were like, "Yeah, we'll put you on magazine, you know, the sort of the catalog first of all." And so it was, you know, it was basically the same process as a magazine, only, you know, you're not writing your own stuff. You're you know, obviously sort of adapting marketing content and putting it in there and that kind of thing. So actually, you know, I found it very easy. And what was interesting was just being able to learn about the philosophies and the process and, you know, the things you could say and the things that you can't say. It's like, you know, you can't say that because that's making a promise that we'll get sued about. But if you tweak that one word, it becomes puffery, which is a claim that can't really be substantiated. So if the person doesn't think it's true, you just say, "Oh no, it's just us being marketing people." You know, that's just the way we've said it, as opposed to making a specific project promise that you can get sued about. So all those kinds of little tiny nitty-gritty details, you know, how marketing works, dealing with the marketing people that, you know, were responsible for sales and sort of what drove them and you know what their goals were and things. So all of a sudden it's like this opened up this big box of information of like, not only do I now understand sort of how this whole thing works, but also sort of what makes people tick, which put sort of things that had happened in the past about, you know, why I'd been asked about this by an advertiser or, you know, all of a sudden say, "Oh, that makes sense now. He asked me that because he wanted to do," you know, you get, you know, that sort of retrospective understanding about certain things in the past that might have been puzzling, you know. So it was an interesting gig.
Very cool. And so after Bank of America, you go back into gaming, right?
Yes, not sort of fully into gaming. I basically joined. I went back to who they were now called Future, which was the Imagine Games that originally had IGN. I gave them a call and just said, you know, I'm looking for work, and they said, well, we're setting up a custom publishing division where, you know, we want to make custom magazines for whoever wants us to make them. So I joined, and I ended up making a very, very cool, like, high-end guitar magazine for a company called Paul Reed Smith Guitars that make these incredible, quite expensive, but, you know, they have cheap ones, but a lot of them are very high-end, beautiful guitars. So we had this sort of guitar magazine where you had these lovely pictures of their guitars and the pop stars that played them being interviewed. So we did that. I did the official World of Warcraft magazine, which was, you know, probably the best magazine I've ever made. Definitely the most difficult because you were dealing with Blizzard when it was, you know, at its prime, when everything was, it'll be ready when it's ready. So, you know, for a magazine publisher where you have a deadline and Blizzard are just saying, I think we need to send this to one of our developers in Portugal because we're not sure whether this is, you know, quite the right thing, and we want their perspective. You know, it's just like, geez. So we did make these magazines, but they were always months and months and months late, and because of that, you know, it created this sort of, you know, the revenue that we thought we would get for 4 magazines, you know, 4 quarterly magazines in a year, we'll make this much. No, we only actually managed to make 2 magazines in a year because actually the third one then slipped into the next year because Blizzard are dicking about with us. But fair play, you know, what we did end up with was these fantastic looking magazines with by far the best illustrations, you know, you'd see anywhere. Fantastic sort of, you know, Warcraft art and stuff. And we did, you know, plenty of other stuff, but did a magazine for Best Buy, which is like a sort of, like a traditional games magazine with proper reviews and stuff that they sold in the store, but also gave away if you joined their gaming club and stuff like that. So it was a fun job for sure.
Now, these custom magazines, how did the business model of financing the magazine differ? Was there a big chunk of change coming from the person ordering it? Or was it a more traditional model of advertising, because these are U.S. publications, advertising paying for the creation of the magazine and then just some added benefits from business relationships like place where you could sell it or advertisement in a game or something like that?
You know what? It was all of the above, depended on the publication. So quite a few of them were created using like marketing dollars, promotion. So Paul Reed Smith, that magazine, that was completely funded by their marketing department and sent out to their customers as a sort of kind of a retention program. Sort of, you bought one of our expensive guitars, you'll get our magazine so you can read about what we're doing and maybe buy a new one. So that had no advertising in it at all. The World of Warcraft magazine, that was subscription only. It wasn't sold on newsstands, and you subscribed through Blizzard's website. So that was 100% subscription revenue, no ads. The Best Buy magazine, that had proper ads in it. They also sold it in their stores. You could also subscribe to it, but it was also part of their sort of video gamers club thing. You spend $20 a year, whatever it was, and you get a subscription to the magazine. So, in that sense, it was quite fun because we never knew quite what sort of business model a client might want, and sometimes they didn't know either. We sort of have to figure it out. It's like, can you sell this to your customers? Oh, no, they wouldn't want to buy it. Can you give it away to them free? Yes. All right. Would you accept advertising? And so the process would go until we figured out how to make it make money, basically.
Very cool. Must have been interesting then, as having to deal with a very different side of things.
Yeah. Well, it was fun. I mean, it's, it was at that point really where I'd, the guy that ran the Futures Custom Publishing Unit, John Gower, he and I worked very, very closely together, and we'd usually go on business trips together. Actually, he would, he'd play the business role, and I'd be the creative person, coming up with sort of ideas and sort of approaches and things like that. I might have creative materials for them to look at and that sort of thing, and so we were both key to signing business. Sort of, he would sell them on the business, and I would sell them on the concept.
Very cool. And so after that gig at Future, where do you go next?
So after Future, I went to I got an opportunity to work at GamePro, and I kind of knew that it was on its way out. I knew magazines were sort of past their sell-by date, but I just couldn't resist it. It's like I'd known GamePro since the the very early 90s, and I just thought, I'll give it a go. They had a website, they had the magazine. I'll see what I can do with it. So I went over there, and it was really fun to sort of produce a classic old school video game magazine. I actually spent a lot, I didn't spend too much time on the magazine, frankly. We had a great team that really knew what they were doing. I spent more time on the web because I thought, if we can save this, it'll be the web that carries it. And actually, we managed to turn things around. But at the point where we hit our first sort of big target, which was 1 million uniques a day, which wasn't huge, but certainly far more than when I joined. The company just kind of went, we can't afford this. Part of the problem was the fact that the company was an old school media firm that had a ton of magazines and was sort of transitioning to what it would eventually become, which was sort of like a data analysis kind of company, which is more about sort of marketing and that sort of thing, and where they'd originally been a publishing company, and because they'd been a publishing company, they had this big, very expensive building in San Francisco that was beginning to become pretty empty, and we occupied one of the floors, and the amount of money we were having to pay for our offices, that alone kind of was putting us out of business, let alone the fact that at that point nobody was buying ads in magazines because everything was going online, and our online publication was so far behind everybody else's that even though we made a good effort and we had a fantastic team of people, we just didn't have the marketing or the momentum to be able to sort of really drive it. So they basically cut their losses and said, we're done, and you're out. You're all out, and that was it. Very sad, but at the same time, not unexpected.
Understood. And so, with the demise of GamePro, did you want to stay in games journalism or switch again?
Yeah, and I still felt that I had something to sort of give on the online front. So after talking to Rupert Lohman, who was then the owner of Eurogamer, we talked about launching US Gamer, the US equivalent of Eurogamer, and which we did. At the end of the day, it was. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was very fun. We had a lovely little team, but launching a brand new video game website in whenever it was 2013 or 2013, I think it was. You're going up against all the established sites, the GameSpots, the Giant Bombs, the IGNs, you name it, and so we made a very, very cool, very fun to read, and sort of niche-y gaming site that had no marketing behind it. It was, it was all self-promoted, and we sort of bumbled along, and it lasted through till near the end of the decade before the company sort of just said, yeah, it's just not really working. But it was cool because the people that we had on it, a lot of them were sort of specialized in more unusual games, sort of role-playing games and things. So it sort of became known for that. So we had a nice little audience of people that enjoyed what we wrote about in the sort of the niche-y stuff that we wrote about. We'd obviously review some of the bigger games, but it was more about sort of creating. We knew we were never going to grow the numbers, so it was just kind of maintaining a sort of a solid group of people that would come back daily and at least keep the ad revenue sort of churning over.
Gotcha. And so, where does that leave you once US Gamer shutters?
That was sort of interesting because at that point I was. Part of the sort of working at US Gamer, I just began to realize it's like, I'm not really enjoying the sort of the editorial environment post, this rise of social media. It's like, I love talking to people. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, chatting to people and having fun and that kind of thing. But the trouble is, it's like if you're writing opinions online, it's like you got a huge target on your ass. And I don't mind having, reasonable discussions with people. The trouble is, it's like you've always got these just horrible people out there that just, for whatever reason, they're going to let you have it and they're going to be horrible to you. And not only that, they're going to come back the following day and keep on doing it because it makes them feel better, or that for whatever freaking reason that these people do it, and I just sort of began to get some of that, and I was just like, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm really cut out for this. I don't want to have to deal with people being horrible to me just because I have an opinion about games. You know, it's like, sure, we can discuss a difference of an opinion, but it's never about that. It's about someone just saying, you're a fucking twat, saying, you know, that sort of thing. And it's like, no, I don't want to put up with that. So I kind of thought, what could I do? And at that point, just sort of went back to my Virgin days and sort of thought, maybe I can, you know, test video games professionally again and find something. And I kind of got lucky and did. I found a job at a testing company called VGM, and which is where I've been for the last five and a bit years. And we test everything from AAA, huge, the biggest games on the planet, to little funny match 3 mobile games and stuff. So we've got, you know, all of that sort of spectrum of stuff that we test. We do UI tests, you know, concept tests, you know, gameplay demos, mock reviews of finished products, everything, you know, you name it, we test it. We're very rigorous. And, you know, it took me probably about a year to sort of really fully learn the ropes, because, you know, a lot of the testing has got to be rigorous. You know, you don't fuck about. You know, things are being, you know, questions are asked in the same way. You don't want, you know, stupid variances of people misinterpreting things and giving different types of answers. So the questions have to be clear and all this kind of stuff. And basically, you know, my job, largely, depending on the test, largely involves watching people play a game, you know, then listening to them talk about it as we ask questions about specific things. You know, do you like playing as this character? If not, who would you want to play as? Do you like the story? If not, what kind of story do you want? You know, all of those kinds of things. And then we also, you know, have them take surveys and stuff. So I look at the survey data and then create reports based on that test that, you know, will tell the company, yes, your game is actually a great idea. However, you know, people don't want to do that. They want to do this, and we'll make a bunch of recommendations. So it's funny. It's sort of it's a combination of reviewing, having that experience of video games and the business to be able to make recommendations that aren't crap. It's like, you know, if we're going to suggest a company change the direction of their game because people don't want that, we better have a really good case for it, and also have a very, very good suggestion that we know is a good one, that, you know, a year later they're not going to come back to us and say, well, we did what you did and it lost us $5 million or whatever, you know. So it's I love it. It's a really fun business, and you know, you get to see all this, you know, a lot of early stuff in development. You work with, you know, some very cool companies, and you know, it's satisfying, because even though I'm behind the scenes now, it's like, you know, we're testing games and getting the chance to potentially, you know, steer some very, very important things. Everything we do is under NDA, but you know, we did one of the games that we did test that we actually got a credit for. Sega were great about that. We tested Sonic Frontiers and did a bunch of stuff on that, and they put us in the credits to say game, you know, tested by. So I can actually say, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that we work on. You know, and it's cool. I really enjoy doing it.
I do have to ask. I mean, you compared it with the work that you did at Virgin. But now, obviously, you are outside as an outside provider. Do you have any kind of direct contact with developers, heads of development teams, or is this basically purely you send in the report and then don't hear back until the next time they send you playable builds for further testing?
You know, it kind of depends on the project. You know, sometimes you're dealing with the developers themselves. You know, the people that are making the game, because, you know, they want to hear the feedback from the users. And, you know, when I'm watching a video stream, a lot of this is done remotely. In fact, I work completely remotely, and because streaming has sort of allowed us to do this. But, you know, we will have cameras in the testing room. We'll have a stream of people playing the game. So I'll have one screen on that shows somebody playing the game, so I can kind of actually look at them kind of going, oh Jesus, they pressed the wrong button again, and now they've done this, and they have no idea what they're looking at. You can kind of see that the camera's on their face as well, so I can see, not only do they not know what they're doing, but they're getting really freaking pissed off. So these are the little details we can put in. It's like, your interface is so bad, people were getting pissed and like literally throwing the joystick down, that sort of stuff. So we've got all of this going on. We might have the developer in the room listening to, after the test, we'll sit everybody down in around a table, and we'll have the moderator sit down with his big discussion guide and start going through, what do you think about the game? What's your initial impressions? What did you like? What did you not like? How anything that was confusing? Oh, what was it was confusing? Why did it confuse you? What could we do to make it better? So all of this information is being kind of talked about. I'm logging it. It's being recorded, of course, too. And yeah, sometimes we'll have the developer in the room, and or the marketing person, or just the person running the project. And sometimes they might actually say, "Oh shit, this person says this. I want to know more about why he thinks about that, because it could be some really important point that they've raised." So, there's a little bit of flexibility in the way that we do these tests. But ultimately, yes, the client is usually, they might not be hands-on with the actual test itself, but sometimes they are. But we're working with them. They're looking. They're telling us what they want to test. We're providing them with questions. We're giving them guidance. Like, if you want to do this, in our experience, we've done tests where we've done this and it didn't yield the best result. So, maybe we should try this approach with this kind of game. You might get better results this way. Or, if you want to ask this question, the best way to ask it is this way, because if you ask it a different way, people might misinterpret it and give you the wrong answer, which, if you're putting potentially millions of dollars of IP investment in something, you've really got to make sure that all the information you're getting is absolutely on the money.
And that money issue, because games, obviously, while they're being developed, you guys are, I'm guessing you're not testing final builds because, well, you're testing it while the game is being developed. What's a typical turnaround time? Let's say you're doing a test on a AAA title. Obviously, while you guys are testing it, programmers, artists, and so forth are still
we are fast, and that's partly what we put stake a lot of our reputation on our quick turnaround time. So in a typical test, we'll test a game, and it, depending on the kind of test, sometimes there'll be 2 or 3 days, and we'll have 2 or 3 sessions of groups of people. So, there could be as many as 50 or 100 people going through our facility, because they come in, they sit down, they play the game for, an hour, they fill out a survey, and then we'll pick some of the most, kind of more interesting people that might have provided the sort of the most detailed answers, and we'll pull them out into the discussion group, talk to them for 3 hours, and that's it. So that's 3 hours. We move on to the next session and do the same thing again. So we'll do that over a period of days. We then compile what we call a top line report, which is like a very high level. This is roughly what people were saying. So it's just sort of to give the client an idea of what goes on. So, and that could be like, Jesus, people really hate this. Yeah, we've got some bad news coming to you. Usually it's like, yeah, this is the good stuff and this is the bad stuff. And then, so that happens probably, depending on the complexity of the project, 3 or 4 days after the main test. And immediately then we'll be working on the big report, and we have a week to do that. So usually it's within a 2-week window. So actually, we know that we have to do that fast turnaround time because we are kind of chasing a moving target. And yeah, we can't spend a month sticking about with this because a month is a long time in development. So yeah, we've got to be quick.
And what kind of criteria do you use when choosing the people to be brought in to test the games? I mean, is it just purely random off the street?
No. We have a whole department that deals with that, and they are very, very good at what they do. So put it this way. if company X comes in and says we have an action adventure game that's kind of like Horizon Forbidden West. That's the game we want to test. So what we'll do is we'll go out and very likely it's all about what we call segmentation. So we'll start calling people. We have this mind-bogglingly vast database of people with sort of all sorted by their kind of preferences and what kind of games they like. Because when people can kind of fill in surveys with their sort of likes and dislikes and what they do and what platforms they have. So if this, for example, is on PlayStation 5, first of all we'll narrow it down to PlayStation 5 people. Okay, PlayStation 5 people who have played Horizon Zero Dawn or like that kind of game. Then we'll start calling those people, hey, have you played this kind of game? What do you think? And if somebody says, I don't really like action adventures that much, we'll throw them out. Because what we don't want to do is there's no point in testing a game with somebody that doesn't like that kind of game. So first of all, often if a game is like another game, we'll want fans of that game, fans of that genre who might not have seen that game, so that we can get that kind of, they like this kind of game, but they've never played this specific game. So will they like the idea of it? And so we slice people all different ways like that. So we end up with a bunch of different groups where that allows us to sort of break down the long and the short of it, which is, could be fans of this kind of game will really like this game, which is kind of obvious. But, maybe people that generally don't like this kind of game actually really like the idea of this, because that's really valuable information, because all of a sudden, the company will kind of go, oh, we might be able to expand our audience because this seems to be appealing to people that don't normally buy that. So yeah, it's complicated. It's all about segmentation, and that sort of allows us to sort of create this broad spectrum of results that the company can really sort of see where their money's going and kind of who might buy it. Some of the questions might be, would you buy this game at $70? And people are like, fuck that. It looks like a, crappy, cheap game. It should be $40. I'll only pay $40 for a game like that. So, a recommendation might be people just don't perceive this property as being a AAA and certainly won't pay a AAA price for it. So, your choices are you either do more to it, you make it, you add things to it to make it feel bigger, or you reset your expectations and sell it at this price, or you completely ignore us and do whatever you want. I mean, which sometimes people do, and that's fine.
To their own detriment.
Sometimes, yes. No names mentioned.
No names mentioned. Do you guys internally, for your own edification, track the results of the games that you have tested in order to see? Okay.
Yeah, that's part of our secret sauce. Is we have a database of it's a mind-bogglingly vast database of kind of the way people rate things and the games we've tested and how people rate them. And so yes, we can compare a game very, very, very on a very detailed level with how it performs against other similar products. And that actually is really important, because what that often tells you is, yeah, this game looks good from this angle, but when you really look at it and when you compare it to all the other things, it's just not testing as well as other games. And this is why. And that's big. That sort of that experience is what really makes us very, very good at what we do, is because we can then compare it with real life actuals and say, look, the bottom line is the average sort of fun rating of a game that is this, and your game is there, and it's falling behind, and the test is part of the test is for us to explain, figure out why that might be. Maybe the hero just isn't appealing, or maybe the story, or maybe there's something about it people don't like, or they don't think it's got enough levels, or whatever it is. any number of reasons why people might not like a game or an idea or a concept or on art or whatever it is we're testing.
That segmentation that you talked about, does that also include the segmentation between console, PC, and handheld device?
Oh, you name it. We slice on like thin ham. It's a Nintendo Switch owner who likes sports games but doesn't like this. Yep, we can do that. It really is like that macro, and because it's that important. Oftentimes, you want to test very specific kinds of people, so you can, so you can look at those differences and go, shit, people over 40 hate this, but people between 20 and 30 love it. All right, now we need to figure out why.
Gotcha. So now I was thinking more along the lines of, because there's so many of the AAA games now are multi-platform across, and whether or not there's still a significant difference between the games that will appeal to PC players, computer players versus console players, or has that wall diminished over the years?
Nah, I mean it. Kind of yes and no, but it is interesting. People buy a Switch to play certain kinds of games. They'll buy an Xbox to play certain kinds of games, and you have people that only want to buy an Xbox and people that only want to buy a Switch. So it's all about sort of us sorting out those people for testing so that we have the right people. And it's the kind of question you ask is, what's your primary platform? How long do you play it? What kind of games do you like? What kinds of, are you open to the idea of using a controller even, for a PC player? Because some PC players are keyboard only. So yeah, crazy detail. It's all about the segmentation.
Awesome. So I'm guessing that there's no end in sight to this chapter in your very varied career.
Not yet, that's for sure.
Excellent. We've been at this for a very long time, and I'm very thankful for how generous you've been with your time.
Sorry?
I end every interview with a two-part question. Mm-hmm. And that is, looking back at your career, what is one development in the video game industry that caught you by surprise, that was very big, that you did not see coming? And what is one development that you thought was going to be huge that ended up not performing the way you expected, basically fizzling out?
Good question. I think the thing that caught me by surprise was a thing called the BattleTech Center, which I saw in the very, very early 90s, which was basically a full-on networked set of computers. I forget how many there were, but it was basically teams of people driving, sitting in like fully enclosed cabinets with a PC and a screen, driving mechs and fighting one another as teams. And so, I think it was 1991 that I saw this. It just blew my mind. I kind of sort of understood the concept of sort of connectivity of like split screen, and I think at that point there were a couple of arcade games that you could link, and so they were sort of linked. But actually going into this kind of arcade, it was dedicated just to the BattleTech system, and playing this online multiplayer game with, I think it was 16 other people, just blew me away. It was like, holy shit, yes. This is it. This could be a sport. This could be anything. We could be playing football, baseball. We could be shooting each other. We're driving mechs. We could be racing. It's like, this is it. And yeah, absolutely blew my mind. I remember walking out of that just sort of, I can't believe what I've just played. And so yeah, I mean, and considering that, I experienced that at a time when there were still people sort of loading games on their Spectrum from tape, and here I am playing a full-on networked, multiplayer 3D fighting game with robots. Yeah, that was amazing. And then probably from almost the same era, kind of VR, which I know it's been successful and it exists, but I really thought it was going to be the thing when I first saw it in 1993, and I was like, this is going to be huge, and then it just sort of stumbled along and kept stumbling, and it's kind of still stumbling really. It's cool tech. The new PlayStation thing is great, but I'm just not seeing. I'm not seeing that killer app, and it just feels to me like it will always be this a bit nichey and a bit specialized. Very cool for sure, but it's just not the thing that I thought it was going to be when I first saw it, and I was like, wow, this is gonna change the world. It kind of didn't really.
I can only agree on both counts. As somebody who has played BattleTech, not in a 16 person, but in a 7-person configuration or 8 people, yeah, it's still impressive today.
Yeah.
But yeah, I cannot thank you enough. This has been absolutely fascinating to get just both sides of the Atlantic, the publication, the dissemination of information about games, and your insights, especially with your current job of the development of games, especially how they've because they've grown so complex. Very fascinating. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
No, I think I think we've covered all the bases. It's been really fun. I've really enjoyed the opportunity. So thank you for asking lots of really fun to answer questions. I've really enjoyed chatting with you.
Excellent. Then in that case, thank you very much, and keep up your good work, and make sure we don't have to play any really, really terrible games.
I will try my best.
I hope you've enjoyed another Video Game Newsroom Time Machine interview. You can leave us comments on Twitter, Instagram, and if you like what we're doing here, drop us a couple of bucks on Patreon. All the links are in the description below.